I realized I want to know how many of you were here last night? Okay, good, thank you. And you still came. I'm sorry, I got to get this just a tad out of my face, but it'll still be there. What I want to cover are 10 principles in translation, but because you heard what I said last night, I'm not going to repeat that in real detail. That's why I wanted to know how many of you were here before. I started last night talking about the nature of translation and how we communicate. And sarx has a range of meaning. The word flesh in English has a range of meaning. There is an overlap. Sometimes sarx means flesh, but there are times that sarx doesn't mean flesh, and there are times that flesh doesn't mean sarx. That's the point of the illustration. And this is part of the real challenge of translation, because languages don't line up exactly. It's always a judgment call. It's always an interpretation to decide how to translate not only words, but also grammar. In the early days of the ESV, this was what 1 Timothy was, in accordance with the glorious gospel of the blessed God. Now, if you know Greek, glorious is an Hebraic genitive. I think it's obviously an Hebraic genitive. But there was a very well-known pastor in Minnesota that objected, and so it got changed in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God. I think the only change that we did because John Piper, John wants all the glory he can get out of the Bible, right? And I think this was the only change we ever made that John requested in the process of doing the ESV. But this is part of the problem. The vocabulary doesn't line up, the grammar doesn't line up either. You have to make a decision whether the Greek word behind glory is in a genitive chain, like it is in the second, or whether it's what's called an Hebraic genitive. Hebraic genitive is just a way of taking a noun and making it modify another noun. And when we do that in Greek, it's called an Hebraic genitive. You communicate with grammar, but there's choices to be made. And sometimes you can stay ambiguous. The ESV worked really hard to be ambiguous when we thought the Greek was ambiguous. But there are certain times that you simply have to make a decision. You can't go word for word. And the old Latin proverb is translators are traitors. Any time you do translation work, you can't hit the nail on the head. You can rarely, I should say, get it just exactly right. You generally under-translate, you generally don't convey all of the meaning of the Greek, or if it's a really important theological passage, perhaps we would over-communicate a little to try to get the full meaning apart. That's why if you listen to simultaneous translators, it always takes them longer to do it. Just listen to UN translators. And the speaker will say 2 sentences, and the translator will say 5. Well, that's because they're trying to get everything that the person said, and you just can't do it with the same number of words. This is one of my favorite examples of how it's so hard to nail something on the head when it comes to translations. So Paul is asking the question, shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? And I don't know what, NASB says, may it never be. Okay, that's pretty good. The ESV is by no means, it's pretty good. NLT, of course not, is like the worst translation in the NLT. They completely missed it because, and the King James is God forbid. And I'd like to use this as an example to say something positive about the King James, because the King James got it right. Now, the Greek phrase doesn't have the word God, it doesn't have the word forbid, it's me genoita. Well, me is your negation, and genoita is the optative of genomai. May it not even be a wish. It's the strongest way in Greek to say no. Shall we continue in sin that grace can abound? No! Okay, that's me genoita. You can't, in a written word, you can't translate no! So you got to find what's the strongest way to say it. King James did a great job. NLT did a terrible job. So you can see the problem. How do you that's just grammar and why it is difficult to do these translations. Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as is in heaven. Completely undertranslated. Because the verbs are what part of speech? They're imperatives. They're commands. Now, when a lesser commands a greater, we call them imperatives of entreaty. You don't command God, but you entreat God. But they're grammatically, they're imperatives. And we're calling on God to act. God, send your kingdom. God, may your will be done. And some translations are bold enough to actually translate the Greek. May your kingdom come soon, which is interesting that they added soon. May your will be done. See what they're doing? They're trying to get it imperatival for sin. But of course, the problem is, of all the passages in the Bible, this is the one you don't touch.
All right? You do not touch the Lord's Prayer. And there's only one or two translations that don't have the word hallowed, even though nobody knows what the word hallowed means unless they've been taught. But, you're under-translating usually. Sometimes I like to say, this is my little saying, language is the stringing together one ambiguity after another. Language is imprecise. Hebrew's horrific. There's no specificity in Hebrew. I know there is. But the way Hebrew constructs their sentences is it paints a picture and then it expects the picture to do the teaching. I don't know how else to describe Hebrew. English is a little more specific. Greek is more specific than English is. But still language is ambiguous. And it is difficult to translate. I hit on this last night, but I just want to mention it again real briefly. If it were possible to translate literally, we'd probably have less Bibles. Because all of us want to be literal in the sense that we want to accurately convey the meaning of the author. And the important word there is meaning. Okay, the goal of a translator is not to transfer words from one language to another. Okay, I know some people think that's what translation is, and they equate word-for-word translations with accuracy. But the fact of the matter is, not in the NASB, the ESV, the NIV, or any translation is there a single Greek sentence that's translated word for word. You can't do it. It's not the nature of language. And so there's this idea that this is I want a literal translation. The word literal means, it has to do with meaning, not with form. So a literal translation is a translation that accurately conveys the meaning of the original without embellishing it. But again, in discussions of translation, that's not generally how we use the word literal. And as I gave this example last night, here's word for word, John 3:16. It's not English. Actually, it's really interesting. One of the things I get slammed on is I must have done a blog on John 3:16. So that whoever believes. And I get some very angry 28-point Calvinists writing and saying, this doesn't say whoever. And you can't really explain to me to someone who says something like that. Because when you have an article, the word the, and a participle in Greek, that can be an extremely indefinite construction. And that's what it is in John 3:16. So that the one believing, that's word for word, what does that mean? It means whoever. And even a 7-point Calvinist like John Piper would not argue that wrong. Right? That's just not how language functions. And an article plus participle is a broadly indefinite construction. It can veer into something more specific. But that's where the whoever comes from. I don't need to beat this horse anymore. Not that I like to. Yeah, I talked about there's no literal meanings of words. So how can there be a literal meaning of a whole sentence? I talked about this. So let's move on. All right. The point being, all translations are true. I've heard people say, well, you want a Bible that's not interpretive. Good. I got a Greek textbook, and after 2 years, you'll be able to read the literal Word of God. At least the last fifth of the literal Word of God. Okay, because the literal Word of God is Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, right? So, in order to get it into English, all people have to be interpretive. And so this is we're getting to the point where translations are starting to diverge at this point, okay? How interpretive? What's the goal of it? Do you want to be interpretive enough so it's just comprehensible? Or do you want to be interpretive enough that it's clear? Or do you want to be interpretive enough so it's absolutely natural? That's exactly how we say things in English. I don't think Mark would mind me telling the story. I sit next to Mark Strauss a lot in translation committees, and either saying it out loud or under his breath, he goes, "That's not how I say it." And we'll sometimes say, "Mark, we're not from the beach in San Diego. Okay, we're not bilingual with Spanish and English. We're not Southern Californians. How you say it is not how anyone else says it. Okay, this is it's been a running thing for 9 years now. All translations are interpretive. And so here's a great example. There's no way to make this, to get the full meaning of this one in. The Holy Christian says, Magi, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east." Okay, that's what we're used to, right? If you've been raised in the church. So the ESV comes along and says, "For we saw a star when it rose." Yeah. That's probably what the publisher said when we suggested when it rose. That's not how I said it. Well, where do stars rise? In the east. It's kind of an odd phrase in Greek, "at its rising," which could be, can be legitimately translated in the east because that's where it rises. So were the Magi thinking about the direction in which they saw the star, or is it temporal? When all of a sudden this new star appeared on the horizon, we knew there's something special about it. So there's no way to blend direction and timing. You got to interpret. You have to make a choice. And almost all translations are going when it rose in this direction. No pun intended. Yeah, it's inte anatole, and it's rising. Okay, so that leads us to the whole issue of translation philosophy, and what I want to do is to lay out the. I showed you last night 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, I'm going to show you 1 to 5. Someone was asking me afterwards, "You start counting in 2 all the time?" No, we're not one. For lack of a better word, we're in this category of interlinears. For lack of a better word, these are the only English translations that are even remotely close to what literal would mean for most people. I wrote an interlinear called Interlinear for the Rest of Us, where it's reverse interlinear. Made up that phrase because I keep the English order and alter the Greek. All other interlinears keep the Greek order and alter the English, which means it doesn't make any sense, you can't read it, but the Interlinear for the Rest of Us keeps the English word order, you can read it, you can study from it, and you can pop down at any point and see the Greek and the information about it. If there is such a thing as a literal Bible in English, it'd be an interlinear. You know what interlinears are, right? I'm going to say. Okay. The second category is generally called formal equivalence. And so this is the New American Standard, the English Standard, the NRSV except for gender language. And when you read the NRSV, it feels like it's really loose. But it's loose because it handles man, he, and brother. If you look at everywhere else, actually the new RSV is much more word for word than the old RSV was. So it belongs in this camp. And then also the wrong initials. This should be the Christian Standard Bible, CSB, which is the update of the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Tom Schreiner was the chair of that committee, and I asked him, I said, did you think of yourself as being a formal equivalent translation? No, we did not. We didn't even think in those categories. So they would probably resist being put in this category, but it's basically where the CSB belongs. These are translations that we talked last night. We're going down word for word on the edge of the blade, and when the Greek stops making sense, they're going to fall off on the side of words. And they're going to say, our job is to make something comprehensible. If it's awkward English, that's okay. If somebody needs to pick up a dictionary and read it, that's okay. If they have to, no translation will pick a translation they know is going to mislead people. But these translations will leave things more open to discussion, and in that sense more ambiguous, okay? It tends to produce pretty poor English, and at times it can be misleading. The best example I know of is the New American Standard translates Paulus 163 times exactly the same way, city. Because one of the things that formal equivalent translations correctly try to pursue is using the same English word for the same Greek word, especially in the same context. Because lots of times, if you have the same Greek word that occurs 5 times in a paragraph, the word is probably pretty important. And so translating that same Greek word with the same English so you can trace your way through, it's important. I think it's a good thing. The earlier version of the NIV did everything it could to stay away from that. Because English doesn't like the repetition. And I think you'll find eventually, someday, that some of that's been taken care of, but I'll let the publishers decide when our work is going to come out. But here's the problem. The NASB says that Jesus was raised in the city of Nazareth. What's wrong with that statement? It's completely wrong. It's what the words are. I mean, it has Paulus in it. Do you know how many people were in Nazareth in Jesus' day? 600. There's a white spot on the road. I used to call it a hamlet until a friend of mine from Canada said that actually means something in Canadian English. So I don't have a word for it. It'd be a white spot on the road that doesn't have its own zip code. Okay, I mean, this was a small, hicky little place. Okay, that was Nazareth. The minute you call it a city, you've miscommunicated. So, and this is the give and take of translations. The next category are what are called functional equivalent translations, also called dynamic. People keep changing, the linguists keep changing this term, but functional equivalent was the word that I was raised with, or dynamic translation. This is going to be the NIV, the Net Bible, and at places the King James. Most people put King James in the formal equivalent category, but there are times that King James gets very interpretive. And I actually prefer to think of it in this category. And so these are the translations that when you go down the edge of the knife blade and the words stop making sense, they will be a little more interpretive to try to look at what does the passage mean and how do you convey that meaning. And if Greek uses a preposition, but if in order to convey the same meaning in English we use a participle, that's okay. We can go from a preposition to a participle, there's not a problem. So it's dynamic in that sense, looking at what it means. Now, all translations do this, okay, just to different degrees. So here's the most interpretive verse in the ESV. And know what it is. The one who is born of God does not. Well, it's a present tense in Greek, and so you have an option. You can translate it sin, or keep on sinning. And I was really curious. My dad and I did all the initial suggested changes to the RSV that then went to the committee for final okay that became the ESV. And I remember Dad would just say, it'll be really interesting what happens with the committee on this verse. Because this is, for the ESV, is very interpretive. So we suggested, I think it was keep on sinning. And it passed with unanimous vote. No discussion. And I looked over at one of the translators that argued against most of the changes. And I said, I'm shocked that you voted for that. And he goes, the problem of perfectionism is still so prevalent. We can't give them a verse that seems to suggest that there's a second work of grace where God eradicates your sin nature. So we can't say the one born of God does not sin. Okay, that's the most interpreted verse in the original ESV. So we're all doing interpretation. The question is, how much are you willing to do to achieve your goals? Functional equivalent would be a little more. It blurs grammatical distinctions. When I was doing the reverse of the linear, I was shocked how many participles are translated as nouns, or verbs as prepositions, or conjunctions as punctuation. And they're all translated, but it wasn't what I was used to. And so these will tend to blur some of the grammatical distinctions. But that's a functional or dynamic equivalent. Okay, I should stop. Questions on that? What we're going to do is, once I've laid out these five, we're going to go through as much time as we have 10 principles of translation, so you can see how these different philosophies affect translation.
This is going back. I didn't catch which ones were interlinear.
There's just an interlinear. I've done 4 of them for Zondervan. Actually, Matt, you were the one that did a lot of the work on one, weren't you? Yes. So Matt and I did. That was reverse interlinear, wasn't it? Yep, that was that one. So an interlinear is just where you list up a top line, either English or Greek, and then right below it you put words that correspond. So you can look at the book Matt has afterwards. And you'll see
It's not.
No, it's a kind of translation. And they're not really translations, but.
Thank you.
So Miles helped with the other ones. You helped with the reverse, right?
I did with the other ones as well.
Okay. Matt and I have done a lot of stuff together.
That's nice.
Yes, it is. Okay, so we've got literal translations. We have formal equivalent, functional, and then I'm doing something a little different here, and that's, I have another category. Most people blend dynamic and natural language into the same category. I just think that's a mistake, because the stated terms of translations, the NLT and the NIV are so drastically different that you can't put them in the same camp. A natural language translation asks the question, how can the reader hear the words and gain exactly the same understanding that the original audience did when they heard Greek? So they want the translation to be totally natural. This is how we speak. And because we live in a different culture, what you'll find is the NLT adding in things to help bridge the cultural gap. Okay, so we talked about Sirtis, the sandbars of Sirtis, and the sandbars of Sirtis off the African coast. Okay, that's the example that I like to use. So the NLT is a wonderful, amazing example of a natural language translation. They just did a phenomenal job on it. And on the gender issue, most people don't even realize that the NLT is gender accurate. It doesn't use men of men and women, it doesn't use he of men and women. But because it's a natural language translation, they were able to do the translation in such a way that you don't even feel like they're dealing with that issue. It's really interesting. But they've done a really good job. We're really getting really close to blurring the line between the Bible and translator notes. This is the problem. Is that because they want you to hear it in the way that the first century person heard it, there's stuff getting added. I found a verse the other day where they actually added an entire sentence. And that's pretty extreme. But that's falling under the same condemnation as the Passion. But the NLT at least is a Bible, and it's not a Bible you can preach from. I don't think it's certainly not a Bible you can study from. But I use the NLT, especially the Old Testament, when I can't figure out what the verse means. So instead of looking at a study Bible or looking at a commentary, I just flip open my NLT. And what I'm reading is what a group of very smart men and women think the verse means. That's how I read the NLT. And I have been blessed by the NLT over and over again. But it's right up against that edge where, is it still about? Yeah, it is, but boy, yeah. The fifth category, this is Mark Strauss's term, which absolutely will never catch on. Transculturations. Cultural, culture, transcultural. You need another LA in there, I think. Cultural relation, whatever. These are the Bibles that completely cross cultural lines. And they are as much about the translators as they are about God's Word. And that's why these things can be helpful as running commentaries, but they're not Bibles. The Living Bible, the original one, is not a Bible. It's Kenneth Taylor's version of the Bible that he wrote for his kids. That you know that he gave every penny he made on that to the foundation. He didn't make a penny. I think it's like $50 million. He didn't take a penny of the LT translation money, or the Living Bible translation, but found it to the publishers. Good man, good ideas, but they're his ideas, wrapped around God's ideas. The message, the same way, and I don't believe that it's Eugene Peterson. I've been told he doesn't even call it a Bible, but the publisher calls it a Bible. But these are so far removed from the text. They're still following the text, but there's so much of the authors in them, the human authors, that you can read them as their ideas. Sometimes people call these things paraphrases. The problem is a paraphrase is a simplification in the same language. So the original Living Bible is truly a paraphrase of the American Standard Version. But the word paraphrase technically doesn't apply to going from one language to another language. Some people call these thought for thought, but all Bibles, other than lineage, are thought for thought. So we just don't have good titles for this particular category. But this is J.B. Phillips. My mom became a Christian reading C.S. Lewis and J.B. Phillips. So I'm all kind of biased towards Phillips, but it's in this category. And certainly the message belongs in there. And I mentioned last time, it's been interesting. When I asked this last night, not many of you indicated you were aware of it, but I've had a constant stream of people this morning that are aware of the Passion. The Passion is not a Bible. It's twice as long as the New Testament, written by one person with a very distinct theological agenda. The problem is that it's coming out of Bethel Church in Hillsong, which has some good and a lot of bad. And so people experience the good of Bethel Church in Redding, California, and so they think that the Passion, because Bill Johnson is pushing the Passion, is a good thing. And it's not. It's not a Bible. It's twice as long as a Bible. And I think it comes under the curse of Revelation. I don't think that you can double the size of the Bible and not break the commandment and not add to or subtracting from. So, understand the Passion is not a Bible, it doesn't even belong in this category. Have you read a good article on it, Jay?
I have.
Okay, I want to send you one. Andrew Sheed, a teacher at Moore College, wrote it's in Familias. I'll send you a PDF. I talked enough about it. I'll send you two now. But it'll get your eventually, so it's kind of good for you to good to see it. Okay. When am I done, Matt?
When are you done?
2:45?
That sounds good.
Okay, all right.
Sounds
All right. I touched on this, so I'm going to go quickly through this first thing, because I want to get into other things like gender language, because I know that's what a lot of people are asking. All Bibles have a translation philosophy. The most fundamental decision we all make is, are we going to err on the side of words and let you figure it out, or are we going to err on the side of meaning and try to get a little clearer? That's the most fundamental decision we all make. So Romans 12:16, word for word, that's not a new translation, it's just word for word. The same toward one another think. Well, it's not English, right? So you can't go word for word, you have to make a decision. So the New American says, be of the same mind. See, and NASB does this a lot. They want to get the word same in it. But they have to add the word mind. And NASB makes a big deal about italicizing words that they add. The problem is they don't italicize all the words they have. So just because it's in Roman font doesn't mean it's not an added word. I don't know if mind is italicized or not, but you can see, be in the same mind for a moment. It's actually a pretty good, very good translation, because this could really be taken to be a cult. Same mind. The same word going on. In other words, we all have to agree on absolutely everything. Okay? NIV is live in harmony with one another. That's what it means. And it avoids the cultic potential misreading of we all have to think the same way. But you can see where the translations are going on either side of that point, right? John 20:13, in New American Standard of the Bible, the angel says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Of course, I emphasize that, but there's no other way to read that in English, is there? I mean, if you just say woman, it's derogatory. There's no other way to hear that in English. But the word gune is there. So what do you do with it? Well, the NLT says, "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Why do they add the word dear? Because they're trying to indicate that the angel is not being derogatory. There are even a few places where the NLT just gives up and doesn't even translate gune. There's no word there in the English. Because they weren't willing to mistranslate it, but they couldn't figure out how to translate it in a positive way, which is it's very positive here. Dear woman is probably about as good as you can get. I'm not sure I can put up with what anyone else did. But you see the problem, right? Okay, you got me curious. I wonder what the ESV was on that. Well, this 2013. NIV. Oh, yeah, interesting. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" I'm shocked that he did that. That was before I came on the committee. I'm sure the ESV just says, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Yeah. Oh.
Well, no, it's the same.
It's the same one. Okay. Yeah. It's hard. This is a no-win translation. Can you have elders who are divorced in your church? Well, you talk to some people and say, no divorced person should be an elder. And you say, can you show me where it says that in Scripture? And then this is the only verse they can go to, 1 Timothy 3:2. If you go to it word for word, it's of woman, man, or of one, of wife, husband. And I'll ask people, can you show me the word divorced? Doesn't say it. And when Greek wants to emphasize something, it pushes it forward in word order. So it's really saying of one, of woman, man, or of one, of wife, husband. And the problem is this is a unique expression in all Greek literature. The Perseus Project has parsed and input all known Greek literature. So you can search all Greek literature. This expression occurs nowhere. So Paul uses a made-up expression. And, after I've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, I'm going to find Paul and say, "Why did you say this? How are we possibly supposed to understand what that means?" So whatever position you hold here, it's not an issue of faith. The text is not clear. It's incredibly complicated. But the good news is the Greek. So the ESV, with an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. You say, well, that's pretty much word for word. Yeah, except that we chose husband, wife over man, woman. And we lost the emphasis on one. But that's translation. You're going to lose something. The NRSV says married only once. But one, and the NIV 984 says the husband of but one wife. So the 84 NIV had one at the end, but in order to carry the emphasis of its position in Greek through, they added the word in but. So but is not adding to the word, it's indicating the emphasis that the word has in Greek. Married only once, the husband of but one wife. And the NIV, the NLT, NIV, and all modern all recent commentaries have gone that he must be faithful to his wife. What are you going to do? Now this is this is not normal, okay? Normally we have parallels through Greek expressions elsewhere in Greek literature, and so we get help from that. We can't look at Josephus or Septuagint or someplace and find the same words or the same grammatical constructions that will help us do it. This is like as hard as it gets. Okay? The same mind is about as easy as it gets. But this is what happens in translation meetings. And you gotta have something. You have to interpret it. And in the interpretation, you're going to lose something. Gene Guest has a view that I really like. And he says the average man was a 3-woman man. So you had your wife for, I hate the word legitimate, there's not illegitimate children, there's only illegitimate parents. But legally speaking, your wife's offspring are for your heirs, legitimate children. You had a slave girl just for sex, and you had a temple prostitute for worship. And I've checked with people that really know backgrounds well, and they say, yeah, that's exactly right. The average man had 3 sets of sexual relationships. And Gene says that Paul is saying, you got to get rid of the second and third, you can only have your wife. I really like that. It's in the Measure of a Man, if you've done that book. The problem is, it has to have the same meaning in reverse for widows in 1 Timothy 5. A widow has to have been a one-man woman. And there are no examples of 3 men women in Ephesus. So, it's hard, but that's what translation is involved in. Okay. Make sense? Kind of the parameters and the things we have to deal with. At the end of the day, what I want you to see is that all standard translations will lead you to the gospel, none will lead you to heresy. Okay? You can trust your Bibles. And we tend to put these Bibles out on like points on a line, and it's unfortunate because what we really should be doing is having overlapping circles. Just as a guess, my guess is the ESV and the NIV have about 80% agreement. They're not totally different. They're not separated points on a line. ESV and NASV, ESV and the RSV is a 95% overlap. We did the stats on that, so I know that. I would guess the ESV and the NASB is about 90% overlap. So these they're not totally different translations, but they have their peculiarities. They have their emphasis. Okay. All right. So let's go on to some of the other things that translators look at. The second thing that we look at is the whole issue of age. Who are we writing to? Now the ESV, we consciously translated it to be in the translation stream of Tyndale and King James. We wanted a translation that people would feel comfortable reading if they were coming out of the King James tradition, which is why the ESV is doing so well in Africa. All right, and the ESV is just gobbling up the marketing terms, in Africa, because so many of them were colonized by the British, which means they speak King's English, which means they have the King James. And now that they want to understand the Bibles a little bit better, they're shifting over to ESV. It's a very, very natural shift. When I speak at schools, I always find out what people are reading and why. And there's always a significant tension of people that have gone from King James to the ESV. That was our audience. That's who we wrote it for. We didn't want it just for that audience, but we had that audience in mind. So, you come to Romans 3:25, here's the NASB, talking about what happened to Christ on the cross. It says, whom God publicly displayed as the propitiation. Well, unless you got Jay as your pastor, you probably don't know what the word propitiation means. We pulled up Webster's on the ESV. We looked up the word, what does propitiation mean? The meaning of Webster's gives is the meaning of the Greek hilasterion. We left out propitiation, and so did the NASB. Okay? Because we figured our audience was old enough to figure it out. RSV, which had a liberal bias, audience, they went with the word expiation. It's a really different understanding of what Christ did on the cross. It wasn't acceptable to most evangelicals, or at least evangelical leaders, and that was why the evangelical church shut down the RSV. But again, they're going for an older age group. They can look up the word expiation. And he says neither of those words are in people's active vocabulary. So what do they mean? Well, it's a sacrifice of atonement. It's a sacrifice that brings about atonement. The NLT is sacrifice for sin. See what they're doing? They're erring on the side of words, or they're erring on the side of meaning. Both are legitimate ways to translate. It just has to do with what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, but audience and the age of the audience is a factor in this. Metaphors are interesting. This is one of the things that I fight for the most on the NIV is that I like metaphors. The NLT flattens all metaphors, just one metaphors. They're interpreting metaphors. And I think if God inspired a metaphor, and if that metaphor is still understandable, then we keep the metaphor. And the 84, the ESV says walk in love. The 84:9 NIV says live a life of love is what walk means, but they lost the metaphor. The current NIV is walk in the way of love. I voted for that. That's anything to get the metaphor back in the text. It was a very interesting discussion with the translators on the NIV said, that's a dead metaphor. I said, do you ever listen to Johnny Cash? I mean, walk as a metaphor for living is very much a live metaphor. I don't know why you think it's a dead metaphor. Every time the word comes up, we have the same discussion. Listen to I know I'm going to get Johnny Cash's song and play it at the next NIV meeting. That would be a way to end the discussion.
Or a lot of other songs that do it.
Yeah. But Cash used that metaphor a lot. So anyway, audience, can they understand? Now there are some metaphors that aren't understandable, like God's long with nose. Long with nose. You know, God has a protruding proboscis. It's like Pinocchio. That's what the Hebrew says. Now, this is a little more of an idiom, but in Hebrew, the line between idioms and metaphors is very similar. Long of nose means patient. So the King James came up with a great translation, long suffering. Even though it's not really suffering in how we think of suffering, but the King James is trying to get something that was long into the English. Well, we don't say long suffering anymore. We don't look at our kids and go, I'm so long suffering with you. Or we'll say to our spouse, please be long suffering with me. Patient. Patience is the word. Patient loses the metaphor, but the argument is the metaphor's dead. It's not understanding. Okay. So audience, their background, race in the church, those are parts of it. That's not a good example. Well, this is a good example. Actually, it's a good example of why you need to be humble. By the way, don't ever tear down a translation. We get this all the time. I mean, I hate mail for the NIV. Just violent, vicious, from the pit of hell hate mail. Because we're obviously non-Christians and perverting the Word of God because we use the Sinaiticus text, and we're all going to go to hell. And I had one pastor write me that he would be praying for my salvation. Because that's a King James only, it's a slightly different thing. There's nothing wrong with saying, I love my ESV. And here's why I love my ESV. That doesn't mean you have to degrade the NASV. You can say, here's why the Bible's different, and this is my preference. But I just think when it comes to marketing, we have no place as Christians to degrade another translation. Because every one of these translations is having an effect for the kingdom of God. I'll tell you a story of my son. My son would only use the ESV, because we were doing it when he was a little kid. And he finally finished reading it. He was, at this time, a Marine. He was out on the Kearsarge in his aircraft carrier on deployment. I said, did you understand it? And he goes, no, I didn't understand it at all. I said, can I please send you another Bible? He goes, yeah, okay. That was the first time in my 20 years he would be open to reading anything else. So I sent him an NLT. And I talked to him 6 months later. I said, how's it going? He said, I can actually understand this. All these translations have good things. And that's what we should be focusing on. And then find the one that's right for us. One of the criticisms of the NIV, and I'm responsible for saying, is that I always thought the NIV was anti-technical language, terminology. Like the church was too stupid to know what a saint was. So the ESV says, Ananias answered, Lord, I've heard how much evil he, Paul, has done to your saints in Jerusalem. NLT, to the believers in Jerusalem. God. A little bit of difference there, isn't there? And I think I get it. Oh, the NLT. Why could those both be NLT? NIV says God's people. These are different passages. And I actually asked the NIV, and Doug Moose said, we're not adverse to using terminology. We are adverse to the lay clergy divide that's permeated the church. And as soon as you start talking about saints, people either think of Roman Catholic saints, or they think of J and Matt. They're the saints. They're the ones that have to know the Bible. They're the ones that have to do the Bible. They're the ones that have to be obedient to the Bible. They're the ones that have to be perfect. Me, I'm a backseat Baptist. I only have to make half the difference. Right? That's how it works. And we think that the people we pay, we're paying them to be religious for us. And if that sounds cynical, it's not. It's absolutely gospel truth. This is the way the church is in America. Right? Jay, not much of a nod. He's being careful. This is the way the church is. And so the NIV not wanting to use the word saints was because they were so concerned about misunderstanding. So they went with God's people. You lose the idea that we are holy. Because that's what saints means, the holy ones. But it doesn't mislead. This is why translations have to be done by committees. It's very important to do by committees. Because I would not have heard that. The majority of the committee did hear that. And you go, oh, yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
And the NIV uses holy people.
Oh, it is holy people in 9:13? I should update that slide. That would be more helpful. You're holy people. Well, that's not bad. Actually, I kind of like it. I didn't do it, but okay. Okay, so background, age, the use of terminology, those are some things. We're going to get to gender language, just in case you're thinking that. I want to make sure that we cover that because that's such a big topic. A third thing that people look at is style. And the minute you introduce style, you introduce a problem. Whose style? Because Mark Strauss's style on the beach of Southern California is different from my Midwest style, which is different from Indian English style. And we have translators now from every continent except Africa. We're really looking for a competent scholar from Africa. Because people from different cultures hear words differently, and we really want to get that. It's one of the advantages of having a couple of women on the NIV committee, frankly. The ESV we're all guys, and there's 2, sometimes 3 women on the NIV. And sometimes men and women have a common language that separates us. Right? Right, ladies? You go, wasn't I to your husband or to your wife or your girl or your boyfriend saying, wasn't I explicitly clear when I said that? And the person of the gender goes, no. I mean, we hear there's a gender divide in languages. And so it was a bit getting used to having women on the translation committee from my time on the ESV. But it's good because they can hear things differently. And by the way, I finally said, what if I call all of us? And one of Jimmy said, who calls guys? I went, really? So I said, yeah, we hear guys generic. Just don't call us a gal. It's like a girl. If I called you a girl, it would be an insult. But to my 10-year-old, she's a girl. And we just hear these words. Anyway, The guys on the committee, what style? How much weight do you want to give to English? Who's English? Last year on the committee, we spent the boringest day and a half getting rid of the word Shirley. When I hear Shirley, I hear Laverne and Shirley. So I just don't like the word Shirley. But it's not a word that's used in English anymore. And it means something totally different in England. Did you know that? If an Englishman says, surely it's going to rain, what he's saying is, surely it's not going to rain. If America says, surely it's going to rain, it means, yes, it is going to rain. And it means exact opposites on both sides of the planet. Isn't that interesting? So, replacing it with indeed or truly, but I did a lot of trulies. And after a day and a half, I raised my hand and I said, guys, you don't understand in 10 years, the committee's going to spend another day getting rid of all the trulies. And they all like, no. We still use the word truly. So we use words like certainly and indeed, which is what the word means. But it's a style thing. Here's my favorite story. Darrell Locke, professor at Dallas, became a Christian when NASB was big. And so Darrell did all his memory work in NASB. But the Dallas Seminary had a lot to do with the Net Bible. And so when he reads out loud, he tends to read out the Net Bible. So he was speaking to about 100 pastors in Portland once. And I went to listen. And he was reading, and then he put down his Bible and he started to quote. And so he switched from the Net to the NASB without knowing it. And he goes, you talk about John the Baptist and Jesus, of whom I am not worthy to stoop down and untie his thong. And the pastors, you could hear them, but they're pretty quiet. And I went to Darrell afterwards. I said, Darrell, I truly hope you don't ever stoop down and untie anyone's thong. And he goes, oh, did I say that? I said, yeah, you said it, Darrell. It's 30 years old, you can't use that word that way anymore. You won't find the word thong in the NIV. English is changing, not just general language, it's amazing. Contractions are now acceptable, and often if you don't use a contraction, it sounds really weird.
So does that mean we're going to have it all?
Have not been able to get a Southern translation yet. Yeah. Let's see how we can pass this. Let me get to it. Ambiguity. How is the translation team going to deal with ambiguity? It's really hard. The ESV worked really hard to find similarly ambiguous construction. And if we weren't, and it were a really important passage, we'd footnote it. And that's why this passage is, I'm sure it's footnoted in the ESV. It's footnoted in the NIV as well. Other translations of NLT are just going to do the best job they can interpreting it, and they're not going to footnote anything. So these are going through the requirement of deacons, and you hit 3:11. And the RSV says, the women likewise, and there's no the, by the way, it just says guna. Women likewise must not be serious, no slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. Well, see, you can't just say women likewise must be. Why? It's in a list of qualifications to be a church leader. And you can't just in the middle of it go talk about women in general and then come back and talk about the deacon's family. So the has been put in there to say it's not just women in general, but it's a specific group of women. And the RSV says, and we're not going to try to identify that group any further. ESV says their wives, and then we footnoted it. In other words, in this verse, Paul is shifting to the qualification of leaders has to be a proven manager of people as evident in their home. And that means their children have to be faithful and their wives have to be a certain kind of person. So that's the interpretation that the ESV went in my commentary. I went with that as well. The NIV says, likewise the women. And there's an extensive footnote that basically says either it's deacons' wives or deacons. So if gune is just women, it's women deacons. If it's wives and elders. There's no way to retain that ambiguity. And every church will have made a decision on this about the qualifications for leadership in the church, but nobody can say the safe word on this passage. The arguments are 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other. There's strong arguments to go both with wives of deacons and deaconesses. The Greek word deaconess wasn't created to the end of either the second or third century. In the early church, the first couple hundred years, the women who served in regular service were called deacons. And they were called deacons until, like I said, I think it was the 3rd century. And then in the 4th century, they all went off into the monasteries, and you start hearing from them deacons. But it's hard, and there's no way to retain the ambiguity in English. Here's a mild example. James 1:20. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. What's wrong with that? There's nothing about man that can achieve God's righteousness. I mean, you just say righteousness of God, you go, what's that? The righteousness that God possesses? Well, of course, the anger of a human being doesn't achieve, neither does the love of a human being achieve the righteousness that God possesses. See, righteousness of God is so ambiguous, it almost doesn't mean anything. It's the words in word order that doesn't mean much. NRSV, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness, which is like simply the worst translation in NRSV. But of course your anger doesn't produce God's righteousness. Neither does your holiness produce God's righteousness. It means human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. I mean, it's obviously what it means. So how are you going to say it? You're going to say righteousness of God and be open to misunderstanding and confusion and make people really think, or are you going to tell them what it obviously means? Okay, so the ambiguity issues. And there's not a right or wrong on this, y'all. Okay, there's just different positions. I'm going to, make sense? Let me pop down here because I want to, gender language is a fun thing to talk about. Misunderstandings. All Bibles watch out for misunderstandings, even the Indian Stevens. No translator wants to, this is fun, wants to give them, can I do something? I'm just slow. You saw that one, didn't you? I heard that laugh. And the natives showed us unusual, that's the shipwreck. The natives showed us unusual kindness for they kindled the fire and welcomed us all. Natives. You get a picture of the Aborigines in Australia, right? That's not what the word means. The word means the indigenous people. But the word occurs, I think, 3 times in 2 verses. You can't say indigenous people, indigenous people, indigenous people. It's just bad English. So King James was really good at the barbarous people. But who knows what barbarous meant in 1611? Okay, you have to remember that. NIV, the islanders. This is not the Hawaiian dance stuff going on. That's a terrible translation. ESV went with native people, but again, native people, it's bad English to repeat it. You just got to be sensitive to some of these kinds of things.
Here's the say locals.
The locals. The locals. It's really, the argument against it would be that it's almost slang.
Almost what?
Slang.
Get on.
Yeah. Pardon?
Give it a couple of years.
Give it a couple of years, yeah. Yeah, the problem with that, local people, is that it occurs 3 times in 2 sentences. And English doesn't like that amount of repetition. It feels heavy-handed. I'll show this because you laughed when you saw it. This is a rather famous verse. I didn't say it. God said it. It's obviously it's males. That's the point. The Assyrians weren't being very nice at the time. ESV, very interpretive, as one male. That's what it means without the sexual overtones. All right. Let's go to general language because I know that that's a big deal. The charge made against the NIV and other translations is that we're trying to be gender neutral. I mentioned this briefly last night. No, we are not. There's not a single person on the committee that wants to remove gender. That's what gender neutral means, right? No gender. So it's the illustration I used last night of my daughter. She's a female, and when she goes to speak in a colloquium, her bio says they are a PhD student at the University of Delaware. She's not even allowed to refer to herself as a she. She has to be a completely gender neutral. And there's not a single translator, certainly on the ESV and not on the NIV, and I can't imagine the NLT that wants to remove gender. The problem is, Payne, my youngest, goes to Multnomah, and it's an ESV school, but he vacillates between ESV and NIV. And he said, Dad, why are you translating gender neutral? Let's have a talk. And he said, well, the problem is the teacher's up there and he's reading, or she's reading, and the text says he. And I'm reading the NIV and it says they. And I think it was the first time I really could see why people think the NIV is gender neutral. It's not an issue of gender neutrality, it's a question of what does the word he mean. There's no theological agenda here at all. It's what does he mean? And in broad English, especially outside the South, he means male. He simply no longer means he and she. And people don't like it, they can decry it, they wish the language would go back to he being generic. Wayne Grudem really felt that if the ESV captured the majority of the market, we could turn the language back so that man and he would actually be generic again. But languages don't go backwards. They just don't. They may slow down a little bit, but they don't go backwards. And Wayne's not going to get it. He won't get that vote. So when the NIV says they, them, we're not making it gender neutral. We're trying to make it gender accurate. NLT is trying to be gender accurate. The difference is, how do we hear the words brother, or alephoi, anthropos, man, and altos, he. Okay? That's the issue. So, the ESV of Luke 17:3, if your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And my daughter said, tongue in cheek, I'm glad I don't have to do it. Nobody can confront me. Now, Kirsten's bright, and she understands what the words brother, him, and he used to mean. But she says, in the language I speak, this does not apply to me. Kirsten's a good kid. This is not an act or rebellion, it's just, this is where the English language is going. And the problem is we're right smack in the middle. We're past the tipping point, I think, but we're still in this transition stage where those of us that are older, we're raised in the church, reading King James, RSV kind of stuff. We're used to seeing he and thinking he, she. But the majority of English no longer does that. And John has spent $250,000 with a secular Collins Dictionary book to make sure that was accurate. Well, actually not to make sure, they were just trying to figure out what pronouns we might use. So, NIV says, if your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. I smile every time I hear Wayne speak, and Wayne will use they singular. Wayne Grudem is one of the main people in the ESV, he would cross-rate, he's one of the ones that got started. And, but he uses they singular. The problem is that, I don't know if I said this to you last night or when I said a conversation, spoken speech is always, in terms of development, is always ahead of written speech. And while you and I will hear they and will understand it as a singular or plural, depending on context, when we see it written, it's a little harder. And as soon as you decide to go with they, you have to go with them. And them is still plural in our ears. It won't be in 20 years. But we still hear the word them as plural. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that dictionaries started having the word themself, a singular reflexive. Like in 20 years, themself, them will all be heard like they were in Shakespeare, with they and them. Like Shakespeare. Shakespeare uses they and them without an eye to number. He uses they and them for both singular and plural. And so I guess in that sense the language is going back to Shakespeare. But this is the problem. No translation I'm aware of is trying to be intentionally gender neutral. The other word is, I don't know if I have it on the slide, is gender inclusive. Gender inclusive is when you take a verse that uses a male referent, like a father teaching his son, and wants to include women. And so, like the NLT says, as a parent teaches their children. Okay, that's called gender inclusive. In other words, whatever men can do, women can do, and we need to state that. Now, the NLT does some of that, the NRSV does some of that. The NIV doesn't. As far as I know, I don't think there's an exception to that. And then the category that actually is the one that's helpful to talk about is gender accurate. And it all depends upon how you hear alphos, anthropoi, and autos. Man, brother, he. Alright? This was like one of the worst verses of the TNIV. The TNIV is supposed to be the updated NIV. And they did, in my opinion, such a horrific job translating the gender language that it was just an absolute mess for years. It gave rise to the Holy Christian Standard Bible, which was done because they thought the NIV was no longer going to be used by the evangelical church. The TNIV just, I think, did a really bad job. The committee still thinks it's a marketing problem, but I think it's a translation problem. Revelation 3:20, Jesus is at the Ephesian church door, he's knocking. It's highly individualistic, right? There's a whole bunch of people there. He says, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If any one of you, many Ephesian Christians, hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and they with me. It's a potluck. And it loses all its force of being an individual invitation. We came up with like the worst of all possible alternatives in the NIV, kind of like the ESV on Genesis, there's a cursed verse that nobody seems to know what it means. Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come and eat with that person. And that was largely me screaming bloody murder, and a few other people, that we have to make it individual. That's what the verses say. And the committee agreed, and that was the best we could come up with. And they with me. Just trying to be accurate in what it means. These are the verses that are hard. The wisdom literature, which is clearly a father teaching a son, and the assumption is that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? So the assumption is that a wife and a daughter would see the verses in Proverbs and would say, well, as a father teaches his son, so a father should teach his daughter, or a mother teach the daughter, however we phrase it. But it's so strongly, the terminology is so strongly ensconced in wisdom literature that it's really hard to translate. So God deals with you as sons, for what son is there whom the father does not discipline? It's a great translation. And I mean, God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father. At least we get the father in there, but we made the children. NRSV, God is treating you as children, for what child is there whom a parent does not discipline. Okay, there's gender inclusiveness. And what they're basically saying is, because of our understanding of gender language, we're going to throw out the whole history of wisdom literature, which I think is absurd.
son, you don't need to use such as sonship in the Bible? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a highly misogynist culture. Sons were way more important than daughters. And, you know, I don't even know if you would have a father teaching his daughter in that culture. And so, culturally, you're changing things by not keeping the male-oriented nature of the language. But we also don't say piss us against the wall. I mean, there's some changes are necessary in our culture. The hardest issue is when you have an indefinite referent. Blessed is the one who walks not in the counsel of ungodly, and then you want to refer back to that. This is the hardest thing to do in modern translation. Blessed is the one who walks not in the counsel of ungodly, for he, or they, or you, or how do you refer back to that singular? Indefinite antecedent. So ESV and ASB, CSB will use he, NIV uses they. I don't know what NLT tends to use. NRSV will use plurals or second person, which is what the T and I do. That's the hardest thing. And if that weren't the issue, NIV would not have to be nearly as much as they do. This is in terms of gender language. How do you refer back to a singular, indefinite, whoever? Blessed is the one who. That's what is so difficult. So there's your basic chart drawn. It's just that I wish we did it. Someday I'll take the time to draw a bunch of overlapping circles, but that's kind of where things are. Matt is telling me that we're almost out of time, but any last questions? Yes, ma'am.
It's something that I've noticed in speech and even in televised speech, talking heads, newscasters and things, is that we, English-speaking Americans, no longer understand what pronouns are singular and what pronouns are plural in English.
Yeah.
Like either is singular.
Yeah.
The word either. So you don't say, I'll take, I can't think of a sentence, but
I'll take either A, B, or C.
No, that's all right, but either of them are fine. It's either of them is fine, is correct. So when we don't get it right in English, it seems like we don't even know, some things we don't notice in our translations because we don't even say it right ourselves. So
what's the difference between affect and effect? I have to look up the word every time I go to use it. And I just say if it's a verb, it's with an E, if it's a noun, if it's an A, and I don't think it's right. I have editors, so.
But I feel as if, I'm surprised that they is becoming singular, that anyone would say they is fine with me, because that feels uneducated. That feels like dialect or ignorant.
You can go on the NIV site and get a link to this Collins dictionary that costs on $250,000. And here's basically what it says. If you track through the years the use of male-oriented language, he, him, man, even mankind, it's gone along here. And about 1995, the use of male language it's done. They're measuring secular literature, non-secular literature, just the use of generic male-oriented words just took a dive. And just as quickly, about 2 years later, usage came up higher than it was before. So what happened in '96? People said we need to find different words that won't offend the women or include the women. And guess what? There weren't any words. And so the use of male-oriented language went back up, higher than it was before. And then what's happening is that it's slowly declining. You can see they have a great chart. It's very slowly declining. They is a 4 times accelerated curve. And there is zero question. They have a 5 billion word database they search. And there is no question they is becoming the indefinite pronoun. So the one who has ears to hear, let. Yeah. I try to get him. I try to get that as an exception. Because in normal English grammar, they had a C and then has to be used. But, didn't work. Yeah, English, language is both descriptive and prescriptive. Language tells you how to speak correctly, but at the end of the day, language is descriptive. Grammar is descriptive, I should say. It tells us how people are using the language. So people say they ignore predicate nominatives is me. This whole thing of using the subjective formal pronoun for object or preposition, I did this for I hear that more incorrectly than correctly. Someday, we will have subjective forms of pronouns used as objects or prepositions, just because we butcher it so much in English. Anyway, I'll hang around if you have any other questions. Thank you so much.